let's begin that story live. I think that might be a good place to
Yeah,
start.
that's the way. That's a good place to start.
Wait,
It's
are
a
we
fun
going
story.
live? Do you want to go live?
Well, not. Oh, no, I think he means.
I mean,
on
not live.
recording.
I mean, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, fake live.
Yeah.
Just tell me when you
turn
guys
it
are ready
on.
to. It's all
Like
it's all
1,
there.
2, 3, clap.
Okay, we're clap. All right, there we go. We're not live.
We're not live.
No, we are not. We're dead. We're the undead.
Are we though?
I'm not. Well, I mean, whatever.
You're post dead.
Yeah, I'm post dead.
You posted it. So James Lindsay and King Crocoduck are two giants of the what is there a domain? Would you guys like? You guys are kind of post skeptic or post capital STM skeptic. You know?
I'd call myself a naturalist.
Oh,
Yeah, I can go with that.
you're both naturalists.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly like anti-constructivist.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Is humanism at all salient to you guys? Or?
Well, the number of times that word appears in Marx has made me not comfortable with that word anymore. But in what I would have thought it meant a few months ago, yeah.
That's what Marx will do to you.
Yeah.
You know, I read a lot of Marx over the winter. It was a dark winter of disease and death, as Joe Biden predicted, but not for the reasons that he thought.
Well, you did it to yourselves.
Well, you got to do what you got to do.
So naturalism, you guys both have roots. Well, James, your roots are more in mathematics and probably rhetoric, just as a process of speaking and interacting with social movements. And then King Crocoduck, you are also rhetoric because you've made tons of great video content, and it's mostly about science or naturalism. So you guys are in a trajectory to exchange ideas or ask questions or have arguments about the fine points of these things, right? So it was inevitable.
So we actually, just to kind of like cut through the BS, because we're not figuring out how to get to where we were, we were talking before we started. And Mr. Crocoduck and I have been in correspondence for some amount of time now, for plus years. It turns out we first began corresponding. I was watching his videos prior to beginning the Grievance Studies affair, and was particularly taken with his takedowns of social constructivism and so on, and in his kind of exposing the terrible epistemology at 3 different videos that he had done in particular. And so somehow during one way or another, during the Grievance Studies affair, he and I actually ended up on the phone together.
I remember
talking.
I remember the exact circumstances of how this happened.
Yeah.
So I had a plan to do a Sokol Squared hoax of my own, completely independently of you. And I was going to make it a very long-term project. I had very ambitious ideas about basically going through a standard textbook in gender studies or something of that nature, and kind of breaking down the distribution of that book citations by the types of journals being published in, and basically sending a proportional number of papers to those journals, and those would be hoax papers. And of course, to accomplish this kind of massive task, you need a big team. So I hit up a bunch of people on Twitter, including Helen Pluckrose, actually, by happenstance. We have a mutual acquaintance, Helen and I, a philosopher who has been very influential on me. And one of our correspondents, I believe Geoffrey Miller, contacted James because he was aware of the hoax that James was planning. And James and I got into contact after that, and afterwards he would periodically update me on how the grievance affair was going. Today we got the fat bodybuilder paper published. Today we got intersectional Mein Kampf published. So I was kind of I was kind of aware of what was going on.
And in the intervening years, all of these hoax papers have been sincerely followed through, or people have written similar papers that are completely sincere and published them in magazines about fat bodybuilding. And
it's worse than that with fat bodybuilding. Jeff Cole, who is a neuroscientist of some kind, he's the guy who, that phobia of patterns of holes tryxophobia or whatever. Like you look at a beehive and like you start to be triggered. And so there's like this phobia of like holy looking things. That guy, the guy who came up with that, wrote a paper arguing that fat bodybuilding specifically should be reinstated by the Fat Studies Journal because it doesn't rely on any false data, and they accepted it, so they should stand by it. But then he went on to criticize us and said that we were completely wrong and bad in our approach with the grievance studies affair because there's no neutral ground upon which somebody could stand to say that fat bodybuilding is ridiculous. And so he wrote an academic paper, and it was accepted in a sociology methods journal about this topic. And I think it's a methods journal. I'd have to look it up again. But we were actually invited. Alan Sokol got involved himself, and after he's seeing this, and put leverage on the journal, and we got invited to come in and write a reply to it, Peter, Helen, and I. And then before our reply even got published, they published Jeff Cole's further reply saying that he had gone and collected data by polling a bunch of undergraduate students who generally agreed, statistically speaking, that in fact no one could possibly say that fat bodybuilding is ridiculous. And I stand by the claim that fat bodybuilding is on its face ridiculous. And apparently there's been some drama in the academic literature around that. But it's cool because we got to have an academic paper about our own project published in an academic journal as a result. So that's something.
The question of neutral ground on deciding if something is absurd or not, there's got to be philosophy behind that. And is that social constructivism? Is that what it is?
As I see it, the grievance studies affair was basically trying to demonstrate that there are epistemological standards that are not being adhered to by journals which claim to be in the production of knowledge. And I think that this continues to be borne out by the kind of thing that you're describing. I haven't seen the paper, but I would very much be interested in kind of the context of what's being discussed about these students agreeing that fat bodybuilding isn't on its face ridiculous. Well, in what context are we talking about? Is it kind of an abstract philosophical context where the students were invited to engage in some kind of experimental theorizing? What exactly? So I can't comment on that specifically. But with regard to the initial papers that were published in the grievance studies affair, I think it demonstrated a point that I was kind of trying to raise with my videos that James referenced earlier, and it's kind of been disheartening to see the reaction to that. I was anticipating that it would have made some kind of difference
in academia.
Yeah.
Yeah, it made virtually no difference whatsoever. As a matter of fact, you see major medical journals, like things that we would have thought were too obviously hoaxish to try to slide into a humanities journal a few years ago, are now being routinely published by, the Lancet, the New England Journal of Medicine. And so the ideological capture that we're looking at, and thus, since we've got Crocoduck here, the Lysenkoism that's going to follow, especially when we talk about infecting medicine, or if it were infecting engineering, or I guess classically agriculture in some sense or another. But with medicine in particular, the Lysenkoism that's going to follow, we're watching a catastrophe in the making. We're watching the center of intellectual life of our society just not even just teeter on the brink, but kind of gleefully leap off the precipice. So, I think we've talked about this before, Benjamin. The churches up until the Enlightenment were the centers of intellectual life, whatever that means, in, say, most European societies or cities. And then that transition to the universities over the course of, the past couple hundred years. And now those have become completely corrupted in a similar way. Whatever you want to think about Luther or Lutheranism or, Protestantism in general, in a similar way to where Luther's like, nope, time to nail some theses to the wall, because the Catholic Church had become so deeply corrupted by the early 1500s. we're seeing that same kind of level of corruption in the new center of intellectual life, which is going to be located in the university or the academy more generally. And like I said, they're gleefully leaping off the precipice. They have literally no limiting principle because the only people who might have it are either distracted or cowardly or captured, and therefore not taking steps. So the only measurable step that was taken, as far as I know, to clean up the issues we exposed with the grievance studies affair, the only thing that I know that happened was they started to require that you prove your identity to publish in these journals, so that you can't use a fake identity, which is ridiculous because there are a lot of people being disaffected from woke right now. It would be very easy to recruit armies of former woke people who have the credentials and might be willing to do a career kamikaze mission at this point. It would be very easy, in fact, to just imply that maybe such people already exist. Maybe there are lots of them. Maybe I've been working with them quietly for years. Mm-hmm. Maybe there are hundreds of fake papers out there under names that you wouldn't think are fake because they are actually people who used to be legitimately part of your disciplines. And good luck finding which ones they are because there's no way to distinguish between a fake paper and a true paper because of the exact epistemological issues we uncovered.
This no neutral ground, this inability to tell what is ridiculous or not. What is the bedrock? Is it social constructivism? Where did this start?
It's difficult to reduce it to one thing. Because I think what you're looking at is the intersection of a set of circumstances that issue not just from ideology, but from things like careerism in the academy, bureaucratic metastasis. There are forces at play that have to do a lot to do with money, to be honest. People who don't necessarily believe in this nonsense are still incentivized to pay lip service to it or to treat it with kid gloves. Because I don't want to go too deeply into the kind of problems the academy is facing, but there are monetary and career-based incentives to create a kind of bullshit, associate vice dean of diversity in such and such department,
or hundreds of them.
Yeah, like I said, bureaucratic metastasis.
Yeah.
It's not, people who criticize us, they'll say, you have this cultural Marxist conspiracy theory where some evil cabal of people are trying to destroy them. And such people do, in fact, exist, but they're not independently sufficient to create the kind of phenomenon we're looking at. We're also looking at broken incentive structures that are allowing this kind of nonsense to propagate.
Yeah, the universities are in bad shape. They're in really bad. They've painted themselves into some bad corners. I'm particularly fond of pointing out that when Bill Clinton passed the policy allowing for the federal underwriting of student loans, essentially what happened was a infinite reservoir of somebody else's money became available to universities, which then shifted many of their priorities. Because they had the opportunity to do so. And they started to compete for collecting and keeping students as opposed to, maybe academic rigor or research quality or some of the other things besides all of these other problems that were also happening. And they did this by investing in huge amounts of infrastructure. We don't have to go into any detail about this, but just to give a sense of what Crocoduck's talking about. Hundreds of millions of dollars of mortgages. So now you're on the hook and you can't lose students. And so you have 2% of your students are these kind of broken woke people who complain about everything and see a problem in everything and everything's a threat and there's not enough safety and they throw a fit. And if you are willing to bend over and change your whole institutional apparatus to keep those 2% of kids because you're that desperate to make sure you keep everybody and nobody loses their ability to keep paying for school, whether it's loans or lottery-based scholarships here in Tennessee or wherever else, whatever other kinds of scholarships, which was obviously a priority in every faculty meeting I attended in the last 3 or 4 years I taught. That's 2007, 8, 9, and 10. when you're in that kind of a situation, you're going to get led around by the most cantankerous students. So that's just one of many problems, without even talking about, bureaucratic issues, et cetera, et cetera. It's just one of many problems. And so you can see where they're going to want to bring in administrators to placate those students and give them what they want. You need a course about this, or you need, evening seminars about that. You need clubs for this. We need to get those people off campus. We need to make sure, the unsafe events that involve Milo Yiannopoulos don't occur. Whatever it happens to be, if you're desperate to keep the most complaining few percent, then those people become gratuitously empowered, outsized empowerment to renormalize the entire institution. And that's one example of a structural issue the university was facing that led it into this road. And there are probably close to it. There are at least half a dozen that we could talk about, in any level of detail if we wanted to have kind of a boring bureaucratic podcast. Now, for what you're asking about, though, is that weird who's to say mentality. Ultimately, you can't boil it all down to social constructivism, but really that's sort of a key root to it. The postmodern view, of course, if we go back to Foucault's writings, Foucault began, one of his most influential early writings was Birth of the Clinic. And he's talking about the social construction of madness. And what he's basically saying is that the powers that be, those who hold power in a society, can label as mad or insane or crazy those ideas which are properly insane, but also those that are dissident. And so you can actually use the social construction of madness, is his argument, in order to exclude and marginalize dissident thought, as opposed to just genuinely crazy stuff. So stuff that's actually sane or insightful or whatever, but outside of the Overton window, can be classified by the powers that be as crazy. Well, absurd is one of those things as well. Who gets to determine what constitutes the absurd? And I don't know. We've talked about it before. I think there's an excellent. I don't think we can play copyrighted things, but there's an excellent little clip from Saturday Night Live, and I don't know exactly what you have to type in to find it, but the sex education enthusiast is probably what it is. And it's this little skit they did a few years ago where occasionally, they're absolutely hilarious, and they're actually taking the piss out of this postmodern view. So sex ed is a sex ed enthusiast, and he has to do his little disclaimer, and he's got a funny little, Western New York exaggerated accent, so he's comical. Haha, we make fun of, the plebs. And then he's doing these little, chintzy, sexy, sex ed, swinger party classes that he's teaching in rundown hotels or whatever, and it's very seedy. But he's so somebody urinates in a paper birthday hat, cone hat, and then pours it down the back of somebody else and collects it in a second birthday hat, and that causes them to climax. Is that weird? Who's to say? And that's the running joke. Is that weird? Who's to say? And he gives increasingly weird examples, and the whole class is, is that weird? Who's to say? So there's no ground upon which somebody could stand to say that's weird or not weird. So therefore, it's an arbitrary or mostly arbitrary imposition of people who have social and cultural power to determine what the limits of acceptable behavior and thought discourse are.
There's a dark side to this.
Is there?
A few.
One wonders to what degree Foucault's theorizing in this direction was influenced by his desire to, perhaps to himself, justify some more seedy activities that he engaged in, like engaging in sex tourism in the Middle East, where the age of consent is much, much lower.
Yes, there's a lot of reasons to believe that Foucault was involved in a lot of justifying of his various, we'll call them pathologies, to kind of paraphrase Nietzsche. Nietzsche famously said that most of the philosophers don't do philosophy. They, in fact, just rationalize their own pathologies. And then you have our most famous Nietzschean of all, Michel Foucault, who's, grows up gay into, pretty violent BDSM kind of stuff, into seems young boys as it has come out. Definitely signed the Let's Get Rid of the Age of Consent laws in Paris petition in 1977, along with most of the other postmodernists. His dad always wanted him to be a doctor, so the first thing he does is starts bashing on the clinic. There's a lot of like rebelling against the things that he was told he couldn't be or whatever, and wanting to expand his potentialities of being, as he put it, which is a very Marxist idea as well. But you have this whole thing going on with him that it's this very dark side going on, but you can also see that, his philosophy gets turned into, well, kind of anything goes, and there is nobody that can stand outside and say it's just socially constructed what we consider to be acceptable or not. So, for example, with fat bodybuilding, which also has a dark side, we didn't write fat bodybuilding just because it's funny, because it is funny. We wrote fat bodybuilding because, as we have seen repeatedly, even through the COVID pandemic, which allegedly or apparently is, being overweight or obese is a comorbidity for COVID, makes it actually dangerous. Whereas most people don't run into much danger with it. You have them supporting the so-called body positivity. You have, all these magazines like Shape, not just Cosmopolitan, but like Shape, which is a women's fitness magazine, putting a big fat woman on a cover saying this is the future of fitness and fatness. There's an obvious joke to be made there. And, they run the pun, they do the whole thing. And it's like, this is going to kill people. It turns out that healthy at every size is the exception, not the rule of being obese. It is possible to be obese and generally, well off, at least for some period of time, but it is the exception, not the rule. And it's generally the case that it's not healthy. And so you have the same kind of thing. We wrote the paper Fat Bodybuilding to bring that up, to point out that there is this. I mean, as I called Peter Boghossian one day when we thought of the idea, and it was like before we thought of the idea, it was like, we really have to hit this journal Fat Studies I found. I remember telling him, and he's laughing. He's like, ha ha ha, Fat Studies. And I was like, and I remember saying, it's like, and that right there is exactly why. There are 30 million people in this country waiting to find out that Fat Studies even exists. And they're going to laugh when they do, because it's preposterous. And the point of fat bodybuilding was to expose that. So this idea that it's merely a social construct, that we have a sport for bodybuilding where we look at people who go to the gym, engage in crazy weightlifting and other fitness-related activities to build muscle, which is known to be hard, to shape their muscles, to get every tiny little, like weird little lifts, to get every little strand on every little muscle at its exact proportion, etc., starving themselves, super careful diets, etc., to really get down to that super chiseled, 3% body fat. Not to say it's even necessarily healthy. I'm not making that claim, but it takes a shitload of work to achieve that. It takes sitting on your couch with Doritos to become fat. It takes no work. And so I ran into this line that said it takes a lot of time to build a fat body. It takes even more time to build a politicized fat body. And in one of their academic papers, I think that's by Lebesco, but I get their names mixed up. That might be Bacon, Lindo Bacon, but also Linda Bacon, but sometimes Lindo Bacon. That's this whole thing. I laughed about that on Rogan last time I went, not the most recent time, but the time I went on in the George Floyd days. Lindo Bacon. But anyway, one or the other. So there's this politicized fat body, though. I was like, this is absolutely ridiculous. This is the funniest thing in the world. So we're going to do fat bodybuilding, obviously, is what we're going to do. We have this guy that's lent us his name to do the project, Richard Baldwin. He's actually a bodybuilder. It's perfect. Like, he's literally like Mr. Northern Hemisphere from the 70s, 78 or something. He's huge, stacked guy. He's in his 70s now, totally ripped. And it's like, I'm sorry, Jeff Cole or whoever else. It is patently different to build fat versus to build muscle. And it's also patently ridiculous to have a non-competitive competition that is literally an internal contradiction, which is what we said that fat bodybuilding would be. It would be, because it has to be a sport to qualify to be in the sport, but it can't be a sport because there's competition. So we had to thread this needle and give some goofy philosophical argument about what sport really represents. The whole thing is absurd, but it also exposes this dark side. And so there's a lot going on there.
Yeah. There's an apparent contradiction that confuses a lot of people. And that contradiction concerns, double standards. So on the one hand, there are no standards, no objective standards, we should say, pertaining to what constitutes justification, sufficient proper justification for the production of knowledge. And on the other hand, there are definitely topics that you should not investigate, you should not research, certain conclusions you should not arrive at, that science shouldn't arrive at if science knows what's good for it, if science doesn't want any trouble. And this is an interesting kind of demonstration of doublethink that's taking place.
Is there like a method to that madness? Is that like where investigating that, where what you can't speak about as opposed to what you can speak about or what you can justify? Is that somewhere where we could see that there's a method or some sort of ground on which this process or this ideology is working?
As far as I can see, it's entirely opportunistic. You know, people laugh at Jordan Peterson. Oh, there's no such thing as a postmodern neo-Marxist. Don't you know that Marxism is modern and postmodernism is postmodern, and these things contradict? What's neglected in this consideration is that the people who he calls postmodern neo-Marxists, which I think is just a belabored way of saying intersectionalists, these are people who take radical modern ideas. They have a picture in their heads of the world, the kind of world that they want to see, and they strategically apply postmodern principles wherever convenient, but don't apply it consistently across the board. And Patricia Hill Collins, who's kind of the central philosopher, I think, in intersectionality. I know people talk about Angela Davis and bell hooks, and especially Kimberly Crenshaw, since Crenshaw was the one who came up with the term intersectionality. But really, it was Collins in her 1990 book, Black Feminist Thought, who crystallized the epistemology that would come to define intersectionality and subsequently the entire progressive left. And in a separate paper, I don't remember it was in this book or if it was in a separate paper, she was talking about how postmodern ideas should be applied strategically over the course of their praxis. And it's in this sense that they can properly be called postmodern neo-Marxists, and how this contradiction gets resolved. You have the beautiful picture in your head that you want to arrive at, even if it means undermining epistemic standards to arrive at it. When somebody criticizes you for not satisfying those epistemic standards, then that's when you pull out the postmodern arguments for actually these objective standards don't really exist. And then when somebody starts engaging in research, objective research, pretty good research that contradicts some of your own cherished beliefs, then you draw out the modernist. Oh, this is evil. We can't allow this. This contradicts our beautiful world. This is objectively bad research.
What's modernist about that?
The objectivity part.
Utopian, the utopian part, and the objective.
Okay. Oh yeah, that too. Yeah. The goal to have the utopian vision. So yeah, the strategery is really the kind of unifying principle here. So it was actually through Crocoduck's videos that we were speaking about earlier, where I first realized that Alan Sokal had brought to prominence a woman named Kelly Oliver from the late 80s. She wrote a paper, and she explains that they've reached a point by 1989 when she wrote this paper that we're no longer needing to be concerned with true theories or false theories, but rather we only need to worry about strategic theories. And so what you actually have, the guiding principle, is an underlying self-serving double standard that everything's up for grabs, just like we were just saying, everything's up for grabs, except the stuff that cuts down on their project. And of course, I see that the root of that is ultimately, this is the epistemic application, if you will, of repressive tolerance. Herbert Marcuse's grand vision from 1965, where movements from the left shall be tolerated and movements from the right will not be tolerated whatsoever. And that's going to extend not just to the realm of action, but also to the realms of word and thought. And he says, in fact, that it's censorship and even pre-censorship, but it's justified because the whole of the world is already censorious against leftist agendas. So we have to, if you will, to use kind of the woke parlance, level the playing field by doing this back in reverse. So I see this very self-serving double standard as the bottom of it. But then if we go, or as close to the bottom of it, because really the ultimate bottom is what Crocoduck just said. The ultimate bottom of this is that they have their utopian vision. They see in their mind the world that they believe They are going to create, this is ultimately Marxist theology, by the way, they as subject have envisioned the thing they want to bring into objective reality. And it's all just, how do I achieve that? Because anything that's limiting their subjective vision as it's attempted to be brought into reality is some social relation under their theory that is limiting the range of their subjectivity or of other people's subjectivity, that therefore has to be deconstructed or dismantled or broken through one way or another so that they can bring their utopian vision into reality. The name for that vision currently under the existing woke movement is justice, social justice more generally, but there's an infinite different numbers of kinds: gender justice, racial justice, climate justice, health justice. There's justice for everything. There's probably nutrition justice. There's linguistic justice. There's citational justice. What it actually means is bringing their vision into the world, their utopian vision into the world, completely unhindered. And so everything is organized around pushing and promoting that vision. So anything that might get in its way, for example, actual objective, rigorous research, is going to be criticized on grounds that it holds up, white supremacist ways of knowing that exclude others. There's some problematic that has to be brought to bear so that people will find it to be less credible than it actually is, or that only a bad person would possibly believe it, or whatever else. And so it's ultimately that utopian vision of a perfected world that only they in their critical consciousness possess that is their guiding principle. In other words, faith is their guide. They have an absolute faith that they can recreate the Garden of Eden and get us back into it, which is our natural birthright. And you think I'm exaggerating, but I could read to you directly from Marcuse's 55 book, Eros and Civilization, where he says the goal of his activism is to get back into the Garden of Eden. And the way that we do it is by taking a second bite from the fruit of the tree of knowledge. And so it's quite literally that they believe that their birthright is to create the kingdom of God on earth, that they alone have the consciousness to produce it, and anything that stands in their way is therefore demonic or evil or in need of destruction, because it's actually the greatest possible inhibitor of the good.
And it seems like what they end up producing is justification and argument, training. They don't, if the Industrial Revolution and science created cups and cameras and all this stuff, what this stuff is doing doesn't seem to be anything other than discourse. It doesn't seem like they create anything other than papers and meetings and talking and policy, maybe, and then, more words. Do they create anything positive? Have you guys seen that?
I'd like to make a comparison to cancer. And so
it's fitting.
Just hear me out. What cancer does is, okay, in your body you have differentiated cells. And what that means is that different cells in different locations, they act differently, they serve different functions. The cells that compose your brain are not the same as the cells that compose your liver, and those in turn are not the same as those which compose your skin. They're all different, they're all heterogeneous. What a cancer does is one of its hallmarks. There's literally a paper called "The 5 Hallmarks of Cancer," and there's a follow up to that has another couple of them. Every oncologist in America has read it. But one of the defining properties of a cancer is its lack of differentiation. So what the cell does is what the cancer does is it grows inside of your as it divides into many cells and grows inside of your body, it's not just a lump of, you have a liver cancer and it's, here are more liver cells and they're all weird. And it's not like that. The cells have lost their differentiation. They become cells that look like they look the way that cells do before they become specialized.
So they're like darks or Sith stem cells in a way.
Yeah. That's a good way of putting it. And this lack of it grows and grows and it grows, and you have this lack of differentiation, and eventually the organs and the tissues, they lose their ability to function because they've been taken over by these cells that don't do anything.
Except make more of themselves or convert others into them. I guess they don't even convert anything. They don't have the power to do that. They only have the power to recode themselves. Is that all that these?
They have a few powers actually. It's actually creepy. And the more you look at these hallmarks, the more comparisons you can draw. Like one of the things that cancer cells do is this thing called angiogenesis, and what it does is it sends out signals to your blood vessels, and it basically hijacks the blood vessels in order to redirect them to create new ones. This nasty suboptimal vasculature to feed the cells oxygen. And I kind of look at the diversion of resources towards institutions and bureaucracies and individuals who don't produce anything for the society, who kind of just grow and grow and grow. And I'm trying not to be too much of a dick, but there is something to this cancerous analogy.
You don't have to feel like too much of a dick because they actually have a paper they wrote in 2016.
The virus.
Yeah, well, if you've read the Women's Studies as a Virus paper, in the middle of it, they actually say that some viruses cause cancer, and that's okay because cancer represents true transformative change. And of course, transformative is one of their, utopian watchwords. So they compare themselves to cancer. So you don't have to feel too much like a dick. Another thing that cancer cells are extremely successful at doing is masking themselves from the immune system. In a healthy situation, your body's actually producing precancerous cells more or less all the time, and your immune system's going along and identifying them and picking them off, so you don't end up having these other, proliferation problems that become tumors or other forms of cancer that get out of control and eventually go through the stages of metastasis and kill you or shut down your organs or whatever other problems they cause. But cancer cells tend to be extremely good at also masking themselves from the immune system once they get to a certain level of development. And you see this exact phenomenon happening with the woke as well. They're extraordinarily good at putting themselves off as people who just care about the right issues in the right way, and that they're nice. That
they're helping society. They're building it up. They're making us more healthy.
Yeah, that they're ones that actually solving the problems of society. But as for drawing off this metaphor, it is correct. They don't do anything except try to. This is where the one place that the metaphor kind of breaks down, but it doesn't really, because like you said, they can't convert. Cancer cells don't convert other cells. They just grow and multiply. Viruses do, however, infect other cells and continue. And so both of these metaphors are valuable at the same time, because the only thing that I can discern that the woke ideology does is tries to create converts. The essential underlying belief of the faith is that when everybody who's still alive is of sufficient developed consciousness, then the revolution is going to proceed correctly and history is going to unfold toward its utopian end. And so the only thing they actually know how to do is to hijack institutions to turn them into woke-making institutions. They hijack the teaching of math so that the social justice lesson or the communist lesson, if it's in Maoist China or Soviet Russia, so that the lesson becomes, it's like a social justice lesson tucked into mathematics. Instead of, John goes and buys 13 bananas, and for every banana he buys 3 oranges, how many fruit did John buy? Kind of a math problem.
There's a loss of differentiation there.
Exactly. Now the question will be,
everything looks the same. The math class looks the same as the English class, looks the same as the feminist studies. Everything looks the same.
Including also, we talk about the different classes, but also the Christian church, the Catholic church, the Buddhist mosque or Buddhist temple, the Islamic mosque, the synagogue, all looks the same. All it does is reproduce again and again and again this ideology using, like if you have a liver cancer, the cells came from liver, you can tell that they came from liver, et cetera, even though they're no longer liver cells, it's loss of differentiation, and it's located there. So what you're going to have then is people, dressed up like priests, but teaching this other religion. Or you're going to have people acting like math teachers, posing as math teachers, but teaching this religion. And it's like the Soviets literally would have, if John, I guess it's Ivan now or whatever, kills five dirty capitalists, whoever else kills 15 for every 5 he killed. How many dirty capitalists did we kill today? And dirty capitalist shows up, repeatedly. And you actually can see this from the old Soviet and Chinese, Maoist Chinese math education books. You're seeing the same thing now. It's like, well, we're only going to do mathematics in order to understand how its relevance to social justice. We're going to frame out every word problem in terms of some, whether it's critical race theory based or queer theory based or whatever, or even anti-capitalist old school Marxist based, propaganda tool. Every single thing will have to become just a lesson at this. And part of that is because of this undifferentiation. And part of it's actually because the people who take up this theory literally become useless for anything else because they become obsessed with this theory and don't learn anything else. It's no surprise also that generally speaking, there are some exceptions to this, but relatively few. The people who become theorists with the capital T are usually rhetorically savvy, upper end of mid-range intelligence, and abysmal at mathematics. They're mathematically completely illiterate. It's very, very, very common. And so what you end up with is just to be a dick. People who don't know how to do anything except be activists, hijacking everything to turn everything into making more activists.
It's
and
true.
The cancer metaphor and the virus metaphor are both perfect for this.
Yeah. And one of the things that concerns me in addition to this is that I fear eventually this is going to provoke an autoimmune response. If it's not the cancer that kills the body, it will be the autoimmune disease, the fascism that comes to replace it.
Oh, the F word.
Yeah. It's really scary.
How would fascism be the pill or the anti-pill to this?
Because there is no fascist takeover without there first being a serious communist attempt at takeover. There is no autoimmune disease without there first being the disease.
It's the case. The vacuum of legitimacy is where the fascists come in. People become desperate for a solution to the problems that were created by the attempted communist takeover. And eventually, nobody seems to have solutions. Nobody seems to be willing to take a strong enough stand to actually stop the people creating the problem. And then along comes somebody who says, I have a plan. Mm-hmm. And then I alone can fix it, as people tried to charge Trump with. And, I don't know. It's going to get dark here. over my trip to Arizona in December last year, I had this idea. I wanted to make sure I understood about National Socialism and its relationship to woke. So I was like, well, I better read Hitler. So I read Mein Kampf, and at the beginning, he's just like the Marxists, the Marxists, the Marxists. The guy's really mad about the Marxists. He says the Marxists made him crazy. Like, arguing with the communists flipped Hitler's lid. And I'm like, that's relatable content. And then it is. And then he's like, and then I realized that the communists are the Jews. And then you're like, uh-oh, it's getting dark. And then he gets into this whole rant. He says you can't merely, and all the communists do is they tear down, they refuse to recognize that they have their own Weltanschauung, their own worldview. They refuse to recognize this. They refuse to. But it's one that's just destructive. All it does is tear down. All it does is destroy. What people need is a positive vision. And this is where your fascist, scary autoimmune disorder comes in. And he's like, I have one. Hardcore folkish German nationalism to restore German pride on the world stage. Hardcore weirdo race Aryanism that he infuses into the German nationalist pride thing. And like the 11th chapter is where he gets into the race stuff, and it's like, whoa, that's dark. And so you can see where this exact process is chronicled. If you're studying that as an article of history, you can see that the Marxists were trying to take advantage of the dilapidation and the situation in Germany following World War I and even preceding World War I. And then this guy comes along and he's like, this is my struggle. I'm in a fight with the Marxists every day and they're really pissing me off. And then I realize they're all Jews. And by the way, here's this race ideology tied to German nationalism. We're going to renew the country, and that's going to give people something to hold on to, and we're going to fix this problem. And that's where it comes in. And so this is where somebody needs to be, where we all need to realize that the autoimmune reaction is possible, but it's also avoidable. And it's avoidable by people being willing to stand strong against the communism, clearly, while supporting broadly liberal principles like Americanism or American values or Lockean liberalism or whatever it happens to be. I'm a huge fan of the Locke-Jefferson axis of liberal values in this regard, and I think most Americans and Canadians, at least, probably most Westerners, still are. But somebody has to, and many people, really, not any individual, need to become like champions of freedom and liberty to prevent that autoimmune backlash from coming. I'm very concerned about it. because you can see the mechanism coming.
Just kind of retell the story. The communist has a utopian vision that it then enforces on everybody else and turns everybody else into promulgators of this utopian vision. But what it ends up creating is a cancerous, undifferentiated mass that's just leaching resources from the body that it has infected. The body's immune response with regard to fascism is to create a counter utopian vision of another body, of a unified body that then can destroy this cancer and become strong, like this Aryan man or whatever Mussolini was preaching. There's this counter unified, but again, it's very narrow, it's very unifying, and it will destroy anything that's not like it. So it's a counter cancer. And so what you're proposing is a liberalism or these broad values that allow for differentiation, that allow for different roles in society, different ways of thinking.
Yes, liberalism is not defined in this term, but one of the characteristics that follows from its definition, which is its methodological individualism, is its pluralism, its toleration for pluralism. And this includes pluralism of ideologies, which means that there are going to be some autoimmune things here or there. There are going to be some cancerous things here or there. But the point is they're not going to take over the body. You hold them at bay, and everybody gets to remain differentiated. Everybody gets to go perform whatever role or function they feel they want to perform. And you maintain the differentiation.
There was this brilliant, well, not brilliant, like this anti-brilliant response that I saw on Twitter because Nazis was trending on Twitter, and there was a couple of different sources of why. Some people are calling everybody involved in this protest against the totalitarianism that is shaping Canadians' response to, or the Canada government response to the pandemic. And there's this big protest going on, and a lot of people are saying, well, there's Nazis there, and they'll pick up one picture of a Confederate flag or one swastika, and they say if one person, somebody was writing, several people were writing variations of this. If you have a dinner party and you invite 50 people and one person is a Nazi, then you have 50 Nazis. So that rhetorical trick of casting everybody who has the association with that one signifier as Nazis is kind of a wokish response of collapsing all the differentiation in that in order to cast it out or to denigrate the whole thing. So
and it's absurd because how are they going to respond when you point out, okay, this one person at the dinner party is a Nazi. What about that person over there wearing a trans flag? Is everybody now supporting trans? Is the Nazis supporting trans? Or are these Nazis supporting trans rights? Are these Nazis supporting gay rights? Are they? You're exactly right. They don't recognize the differentiation of individuals. The liberal is capable of recognizing this and is capable of distinguishing between, okay, people are different. People have different characters. They're going to fall to different ideologies, and that's okay. But yeah, it's exactly as you described it, Benjamin.
So since we're being good and controversial, we'll just take this a slight step further. So in terms of controversy, the definition, the meaning, I should say, of the word Islam, so now we're comfortable, right, is submission. And so the idea of Islam, kind of its basic nut, with nuts and bolts being the reference here, of what it's about is this: with submission to Allah comes, the good life. So everybody is to submit to Allah and Allah's will as recorded, say, in the Quran or the Hadith or whatever else. And so what you actually have within communism is what Marx was talking about is the need for man to awaken to the fact that he's social man. And social man is sometimes, because it's from German, translated as socialist man. In other words, that man needs to realize that he's, as George Costanza would have it, part of a society. And so there's these huge kind of social contract obligations on people to operate in this kind of social, it's almost like the Borg from Star Trek. Everybody's got to be kind of on the same page with regard to what society means and what's expected out of people. So what you have is this kind of social environment that is the collective, that Marxism, generally speaking, including woke, what their idea is that the utopia arrives when everybody reaches a sufficient level of consciousness of this state of affairs so that they have submitted to the social collective of society, where man and society become co-continuous. There's just like the subject and object are meant to be dialectically synthesized and become co-continuous. Man and society are supposed to become dialectically synthesized as man meant to live in society, man meant to live in a social order. And so what you actually have is a fundamentalist religion that believes that when everybody submits to the not just submits, though, but we'll start with submits to the will of the collective, which itself is a collective that has all been conscientized into this particular view of what a social environment should look like. Then the utopia will spontaneously emerge through the dialectical process. And then we're going to live in it. So what you have is actually collectivist totalitarianism is at the absolute root of this, because the entire faith is based on we don't get to where we want to go until everybody is 100% on board with the collective. And so what you end up with is this absolute inability to tolerate that which they identify as outside or enemy to that. That's somebody who hasn't submitted yet. That's somebody who has not put themselves before the will of God, as it were. But for Marx, there is no God. Man in himself replaces deity, man creating himself through the processes of history, which is the authorship of man creating himself. It's very circular, faith-based project. And so when you see, you have a Nazi at the table, so everybody's now a Nazi, they have to see it that way, because what you have is the potential for that group of, say, 50 people to become contaminated with something that's outside of what the collective holds. So it has to be absolutely vigorously stamped out. It has to be absolutely vigorously excluded.
And it works in the opposite direction when the most radical person in the woke group comes to define the entire group. So everybody has to be on board with the most radical version. So,
well, they have to, yeah.
So the one super duper woke person, everybody has to agree with them or else they are cast out. And you see this shrinking in this
because anyone else is leaving some status quo on the table. The easiest way to see this is where the feminists killed themselves. I don't mean like physically. I mean, feminism gave rise to queer theory, gave rise to the trans thing, and now men claiming to be trans women or claiming to be women, period, have destroyed feminism, or basically everything feminists ever tried to hope for. Why? Because if they try to stop it and say, yeah, gender is a social construct, so there's your feminism, but sex is not, then that's just them being conservatives. That's just them leaving status quo on the table. So the more radical person wins every time. So this isn't just a faith that's got no limiting principles. It's one that's intrinsically inimical to limiting principles, which is why characters like Lenin, who are willing to go all the way, or like Mao, who are willing to go all the way, eventually rose to power in those circumstances, because all they had to do was accuse everybody successfully. Obviously, it's a risky move, but all they had to do was step up and accuse everybody of being, performing half measures or not being fully committed, harboring bourgeois or conservative or counter-revolutionary values, right-wing values, not being willing to take the step was proof, et cetera, et cetera. And when you find the right characters who know how to play that game, what we're seeing with that now is this kind of decentralized kind of social cancel culture, social murder movement rather than a physical murder movement with a megalomaniac in charge of it. When those people are always going to be able to rise. So they don't also realize their danger in that regard. But what you have to understand is that whoever is genuinely able to articulate the wokeness the most is the only non-Nazi at the table. Everybody else is a Nazi. Everybody else for them is a Nazi because they're
sounds like a great kind of dinner game or one of those evening games. Everybody gets their woke card and figure out who's the Nazi when it turns out.
Yeah, it's called the circular firing line.
Why do you think they get so traumatized at the thought of going to meet their families at Thanksgiving, sitting at the same dinner table with everyone else?
Mm-hmm. And that erosion of anything other than a political point of view makes people, well, it isolates them, but it also it that disrupts the social fabric that would cause us to not go in the direction of fascism. The way that we not slip into fascism is this social fabric, this tolerance, but also people being productive members of society. And if one by one there's this casting out of people, I don't know if I'm sure that society could still function without these members of, without universities, without the chattering class, without media. But at this point, we're at a very difficult or dangerous situation where the legitimate institutions are now creating a vacuum of legitimacy. The question being, how do we articulate a naturalist philosophy, a humanist philosophy, for people to constantly, people who are against wokeness, constantly go back to the roots of what they are for, not just anti. What are we for, not just anti? And I see both of you guys doing good work in that direction.
Yeah, you raise an important point, Benjamin. We can't define ourselves entirely in terms of what we oppose. Otherwise, we're nothing. You know, I hate to give Hegel credit because I despise Hegel, but. You don't want to adopt the slave morality, the slave identity. You don't want to define yourself entirely in terms of that which you oppose. You have to have some principles of your own that stand independently of that. And this necessitates, on our part, I think, cultural production and intellectual production. And I've been engaged in some projects to that end, and I hope to. Well, on the intellectual end, at least on the philosophical end, I've been engaged on that project. But for the cultural production end, that's going to require substantial contributions from a lot of people.
What do you mean? Are you doing like some sort of trippy light show, laser light show in the desert?
Yep, putting it on just for you, Benjamin.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, no. By cultural production, I mean works of art and works of the types of discourses that are going to be developed that don't necessarily make reference to that which we're against, but which through their ethos communicates values that we hold, and which, because we hold them, and these values are in opposition to woke values, will implicitly serve as a kind of countercultural force. Basically, what we need is a counterculture, and that counterculture has to have an associated philosophical system with it. I've been working on such a system, and I'll be working on it for the rest of the year. I've got videos coming out to kind of elaborate on it. But
do you have any tips, tricks, or teases about this ethos?
Well,
founding principles?
Everybody's going to have to choose their own. You know, as a liberal, you know, I recognize that there's a diversity of characters, and that this diversity is not the product of people being stupid or people being immoral. You know, some people naturally are going to tend toward different political ideologies, different values based on their character, based on their temperaments. This is kind of a Humean view of things. You know, I view conservatives as being driven by the fear of decay, and progressives as being driven by the disgust toward injustice. So, you know, fear and disgust being the drivers of politics. No wonder it's such an ugly show. Fascism, I think, is the product of despair, and communism, I think, is the product of vanity. We could go into all of these in detail, but kind of the point I'm trying to bring out is you have different characters, and the ethos that works for me might not necessarily be the ethos that works for you. What matters is that we have systems and institutions in place that allow for the continued differentiation of the body politic.
What does that look like?
It looks like me having my point of view, which is actually going to rely on some Spinozist philosophy. Actually, that's in the works. James having his thing, you having your thing, everybody having their own thing that coexists in an environment where critical discourse can take place and where cultural production can remain differentiated. I think the greatest opposition to woke folk, at least on the cultural side of things, is maintaining differentiation, maintaining the plurality of opinions, without allowing ourselves to be taken over by anything they have to offer. When they say that we have to inject their ideologies, their stuff into our subcultures, people are allowed to hold those beliefs, but it can't come to be a defining property of those beliefs, because if it does, then we lose differentiation.
Like feminism in gaming. It's okay for a gamer to be a feminist and still game, but once a feminist starts to declare that gaming needs to be more feminist, or we need to interpret gaming according to a feminist lens, then they're kind of they're stepping over into fundamentalism, and that's something that is there a repressive tolerance principle with regard to metastasizing fundamentalism, and how does that implemented carefully?
So not repressive tolerance, but rather Karl Popper's paradox of toleration. We don't tolerate attempts by cancer to metastasize. If you have a benign cell that's undifferentiated and has its own thing going on, but it's not spreading, it's not recruiting signals in order to make itself grow, it's not hijacking vasculature in order to siphon away resources from the rest of the body. As long as that's what's going on, don't worry about the benign cells. It can sit there. It can do its own thing. Surgery might not necessarily be worth it to extract it. But if it does become cancerous, then it's time to apply some radiation therapy. And it just so happens that I've been building a little nuke that might help accomplish that task. But
a targeted direct beam that just hits the right cell? Yeah. Well, the thing is with some of these metaphors, some of this discourse, of course, a culture, to be an artist, to be a communicator, to be a pundit, either, to run a YouTube channel, you need to be in a state of growth. You need to be finding people that agree with you. You're spreading your message. So in a way, you are trying to reproduce your ideas, and, every group is going to be recruiting. Every group is going to be
right. But not all
metastasizing. No, exactly. So there has to be a value set to decide what is a negative growth, what's a positive growth, and that has to do with, I think, some sort of positive cultural value, getting back to a standard of saying this is crap, this is great, and this is somewhere in between. I think that there has to be some sort of standard to decide that precedes declaring whether a group is bad or not. Like, what are they producing? And what is that based on?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say that's ultimately, the space in which all of this has kind of come up is that, and that's really, what this naturalist nuke, the Crocoduck can talk about some more if he wants, is really targeting. And that's why you see so many religious people stepping in right now and saying that we have to get back to God and we have to get right with God, etc. Because what people are looking for is some kind of a very objective ground that they can stand on that says this is right, this is wrong, this is dangerous, this is not. This is when public opinion should be able to step in and say we need to contain this, and this is when public opinion says, well, do what you want to do, or this is acceptable, or whatever the ranges are. And that question of how do you ground these things in an era in which, we are a couple of centuries out from the church having, just absolute hegemony in terms of grounding, objective, well, really everything, whether it's values, whether it's epistemology, whether it's ontology. They had the corner on the market for a very long time. And then we're a couple of centuries out from that corner being questioned. And so, having a naturalistic philosophy, for example, that into which even the religious paradigm can be fit or can be understood from without the people who are religious are perfectly fine to just take it as their religion. But the problem is that it's not working for everybody. By having a broad kind of naturalist position by which we can understand, value positions, the meaning of existence, and, how we come to understand ourselves and then understand the world around us, so epistemology as well, becomes kind of the fuzzy question that has to be addressed. Yeah. And
if you look at just K through 12 education, it's all being taken over by a single ideology that's populating it. It's all, but the problem with that ideology is that it's focusing all the disciplines to look at and become social justice, rather than if we go to a religious school, let's just say Catholicism is the ruling ideology, but allows for everything to be differentiated and included in it, rather than focusing on everything is about learning your catechesis or whatever like that. So there's a vacuum of coherence or unity in Western liberalism where we differentiated without a unifying theory, and I think we got away from that unifying theory as far as we could without it snapping back into something like that.
That's what I think is missing, is the underlying, what I would actually term, having read some of John Henry Newman now, what I would actually term an underlying theology in kind of a very broad and generic sense, and that ultimately being a kind of, meta-philosophy, if we want to get really technical, I guess, that's stringing together things like ontological questions, epistemological grounding, axiological framework, and all of these is sociological theory as well, which religions I think evolved to do, at a basic level rather successfully through their basically long endurance with large numbers of people. But the problem is that as the Enlightenment came through, like you said, that fundamental grounding got thrown into doubt, and unfortunately, we've had this very subjectivist, they call it dialectical, but very subjectivist mentality kind of fill in. This theology is filled in. It's, we've got cancer working. I don't want to have too many metaphors on the table, but it's very cuckoo bird. It's like it's come in and kicked the other eggs out of the nest, and it's the only one in the game. But this horrible, ugly thing that doesn't do what it's supposed to do and is ultimately a parasite, and that's ultimately what Marxism has done and always does do. And I think people would resonate with that metaphor, of course, which is why digging into that philosophy and having that level of intellectual and cultural production on our terms that creates the competitor that excludes that and exposes it for what it is, like Crocoduck was talking about, is such a crucial and invaluable project that people need to start taking up in a very serious way, which is why of course, being liberal, I openly tolerate them at my own risk. The kind of post-liberal, whether it's neo-reaction or even the what do they call them, the Catholic integralists who want to go back to like a theocracy or whatever. Like, I want them doing their philosophical meandering, but I also realize that when I look at Popper's characterization, part of their philosophy is intolerance of things that are outside of that. And I think that's where you say, well, how are you going to tell? Like, there's a red flag, like our way or the highway. Keep an eye on that one. Is this thing a tumor that's now going to start hijacking blood vessels, or is it just going to be over there, being a bunch of cranks? And at some point, when it starts to metastasize and carry on, and you start seeing a rapid growth in the number of people who are saying, no, this is the way, it's our way or the highway, that's where, that thing has to be exposed and really undercut at the philosophical level, so that, it doesn't present.
Well, if those things populate the centers of government or the centers of knowledge production or the centers of media and decision making, then that's different than if they're just kind of one among many, right?
This is one of that's generally what Popper's talking about as the kind of exclusion principles. When is it time to be intolerant of something intolerant? And it's not even always. He says when it is absolutely intolerant when it cannot be persuaded by reason or rational argument or evidence to the contrary, and when public opinion is no longer sufficient to keep it in check, especially if it gets toward the point where they're threatening to bring out the pistols. That's when you must be intolerant against intolerance. And clearly we see much of that with the woke phenomenon. It's absolutely intolerant of other ideas. Public opinion is not sufficient to keep it in check because it's figured out ways to be a parasite upon our best characteristics like charity of argument and respectability and kindness. caring for people who are underprivileged, etc. And it's rapidly growing and saying it's our way or the highway. But in general, it's the same problem. And if we have lots of people kind of working out, like Crocoduck was saying, coming up with this kind of in various ways, countercultural movement. They're pushing for different kinds of art. They're showing, what it means to be human in this era. They're delivering the fundamental values and even, answers to ontological questions and epistemological questions in rigorous ways within the context of what they're producing. Then we're going to be leaning toward the road to recovery. But figuring out how to do that without being able, because we're not going, I listen to the Christians, I spend a lot of time with Christians all the time, and a lot of them are, we got to get back to God, and it's just not going to happen the way that they hope for. It's just not realistic.
Yeah, there's no going back. The teeth have already fallen out. They're not going to be replaced, so to speak. I'm sorry for all these
Are we on horses now? Is that what it is?
Yeah, tigers maybe. Who knows?
No, look, yeah. You lose your teeth. They're not going to grow back. Once you're an adult, and it's kind of like that. Religion used to play the role of the teeth. Just bear with me here. Okay. We lost them. They're gone. They're not coming back. And you need to install. I feel like such a dork for using these metaphors. I'm going to stop. Whatever James said. Whatever James said.
No, I was really hoping to hear that.
Yeah, because Crocoduck, in your Naturalist Nuke videos, which we plugged several times, the links will be in the description. Everybody should check them out. But they're really good. You preempted the social constructionist talking point by... you should explain how you do this, but you say that science is actually natural. You go back and you show how what science is a process that is always occurring by every basically volitional entity is participating in science. And so I wonder if we can bootstrap in that way this cultural matrix that includes charity, that includes tolerance to a certain degree, that includes getting along, creating all these humanist or human activities, these non-scientific activities, if we can show that they are based on our nature. This is all natural to do this, and it's unnatural to stop that, or it's counternatural to act in a wokish way or something like that.
Yeah, well, I would first caution by saying natural does not necessarily equal good. That's going to be the first thing that
they're going
to ding you. They're going to ding you for that. You have to put it out there. Okay. But I think there are resources available, and for forthcoming videos on the way a kind of revisionary Spinozism might be able to accommodate that. But
revisionary Spinozism.
So Spinoza, okay. The philosopher Spinoza.
Yeah, spin it.
Yeah, I have some ideas for how he might be able to help us in that regard. But when it comes to strictly the epistemological, the ontological, and the axiological features of our civilization, the naturalist Nuke, as I've developed it thus far, does have the resources to act in both an offensive and defensive character with respect to woke ideology. So anytime you try to propose something contrary to the woke, or try to say, no, this doesn't fall under the purview of the woke, you may not convert this, you may not take over this, they're going to counter with something to the effect of, well, it's already been taken over because it's been situated within a culture that we're trying to liberate everybody from. It's situated within discourses and institutions that are already causing a tremendous amount of suffering. And that's what it fundamentally is, and we're just trying to liberate people from that, from these circumstances. And this is where a lot of people get stuck, because how do you contest that a lot of the things that they're pointing to and saying this is socially constructed, like they come armed with a whole bunch of arguments to this effect. And one of the things that they've come prepared to try to take over is the scientific activity. The scientific activity is socially constructed. science, this knowledge production business that you engage in, that you think is objective and that you think precedes politics, actually that's all political, and therefore it's fair game for us to also go in and convert. So the defensive aspect of the naturalist nuke says, actually, wait a minute, science at its core is something that precedes the existence of politics. There's something about the development of representations of the world, models as I call them, something about the characteristics which define them, which are not beholden to any particular culture or social situation or politic.
Or even being. You
right.
make the case. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a bit more on the radical side on my end. I do offer a way out in video 3. You can still restrict it to human beings without losing the character of the nuke. But the big idea here is that science at its core is not a political phenomenon. You may adjoin political elements to it, and when you do that, you introduce the circumstances under which Lysenkoism can thrive, and that's deleterious to everybody's well-being. But at its core, the scientific activity isn't political. So this is the defensive feature of the naturalist. Here is something that they may not claim. Here is something, here's a set of standards that we can apply when evaluating representations of the world. And that's huge. That's a big deal, because now you can start describing the world as it is, independently of political considerations or social considerations. And this presents a serious challenge if it's sustained against woke ideology. That's the defensive side. On the offensive side, I have the criteria, the actual nature of the criteria that I've identified as constituting sort of the essence of scientific inquiry. And those criteria are what I call the Big Four operational criteria. It's a set of criteria that we can use to judge different representations of the world, including and especially woke representations of the world. And this is where I think a lot of the intellectual force is going to be able to come from, because you're going to be able to subject things like critical theory, critical race theory, critical pedagogy, all of these things that are making certain empirical claims about the world and certain non-empirical claims, and we can get to those as well. You'll be able to subject those to the standards that are outlined by the naturalist nuke, the Big Four. And when it's found that they fall short, sort of show them for what they are, which is just one of many competing ideologies that doesn't have anything special to it. It isn't actually supported by the types of values that we attach to representations of the world for our own well-being.
Could you briefly mention those four, those Big Four?
Sure. So the first one is predictive accuracy and precision. Yeah. That's fairly straightforward. How well can you tell the future based on your model? Yeah. The second one is explanatory efficiency. So this one actually has two components, and those components are parsimony and consilience. I sort of wrap them both up under the umbrella of efficiency, because they deal with the efficiency of our representations of the world at different scales. With parsimony, you're looking at an individual model or an individual hypothesis or whatever it is you're using to represent the world, and you're applying Occam's razor. Can I explain it? It's the metaphysicians would describe it as multiplying entities beyond necessity. That's what we're trying to avoid. We're trying to avoid the introduction of posits that are not necessary to sustain a model, because otherwise you're just sneaking stuff in there that doesn't need to be there. And then on the other end, you have consilience, which is how well do these different models cohere with each other. Are we going to have to separate our different models of the world into these distinct kind of islands of knowledge that don't have anything to do with each other, and not have this kind of this more efficient organization where they're all conjoined? So I'm talking about consilience. I'm talking about conjoining them together into a single overarching structure
body
of knowledge.
Structure.
Yeah. So that's explanatory efficiency. The third one is optimal flexibility, which is the theory is neither so rigid as to be immune to counterfactuals. There's a counterfactual state of affairs in the world, with respect to what the model is positing. What are you going to do, model? And the model says nothing. It's what I say is true, regardless of what the world has to say. Right? That's too rigid. And then on the other hand, you have something that's effectively that's too flexible, something that's effectively unfalsifiable. And this is the model that's going to retroactively change its interpretation of whatever is observed in order to fit with the model.
And why is that bad?
That's bad because then it leads to a state of affairs where everything can trivially be said to be true. You can incorporate all observations, even contradictory ones.
Sense of them. Yeah, you're just sensing. No, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then, so that's optimal flexibility. And then the fourth one is rational coherence or internal consistency, alternatively. And that just means that you want to minimize the amount of tension, the amount of contradiction that your representations contain. Mm. And if you first.
No, continue.
Oh, I was about to say, if we apply these standards to woke ideology, woke ideology is not all empirical, as you know. A lot of it is very qualitative. There are interpretive elements, there are historicist elements, there are phenomenological elements. And I think the first step in any kind of intellectual clash between those who are wielding the nuke and woke folk is going to be to force them away from that qualitative realm and into the empirical realm. And it's here in the empirical realm where you can detonate the nuke. So kind of to give you an illustration of what that might look like, we can talk about the way lived experiences are talked about. So let me think about how to put this.
I mean, I have a pretty good one.
Okay.
That nukes them on lived experience, which is the panic attack. I've trotted this out a number of times, and people really resonate with it. So you're having a panic attack. Something's happening. Your chest hurts. You can't breathe. You're freaking out. Feels like a heart attack. You go to the doctor. You go to the hospital. You roll in. You tell the person at the ER, the admissions desk, I'm having a heart attack. They immediately throw you on a bed, bring you back, wheel you back down the hall, and the doctor comes and they start trying to hook up the EKG to you because now that's the realm of empiricism. Let's check your heart and see what's going on. And you say, no, my lived experience is that I'm having a heart attack. Hit me with the paddles. Get the defibrillator and hit me. You're going to die. He's going to electrocute you and kill you or something, whatever it does. It's going to shock your heart and actually stop it. Because you're having a panic attack, you're not actually having a heart attack. And so the EKG represents, kind of metaphorically here then, the injection of that empirical situation, the empirical paradigm over the experiential paradigm, where it's a very palpable thing where if you get this wrong, you're asking the doctor to kill you. If you demand that the doctor defer to your lived experience over taking the step of gathering the relevant empirical data, your life is on the line. Yeah. Whereas, once the doctor hooks up the EKG to you, immediately they're going to see you're not having a heart attack. This is not what's actually happening. What's actually happening is that you are freaking out and you might need a sedative, but you probably just need to chill out and breathe for half an hour and maybe watch some cartoons.
Mm-hmm. And what James is gesturing at here is actually a really serious philosophical problem called the problem of underdetermination, which is that for any given set of facts, there are a zillion different interpretations, often mutually contradictory interpretations for that set of facts. There's a difference between what you're experiencing, the rapid heart rates, and your interpretation of your experience, what that means. And that's a distinction that has political application in terms of how you can counter lived experience kind of rhetoric. So let's say you're talking to somebody and they say it's the lived experience of Black Americans that racism is endemic at all levels of society, and so in the interest of compassion and equity, we have to use that presupposition as the filter through which social data is analyzed. Mm-hmm. And much of the force of this kind of viewpoint is purely rhetorical. If you're found to disagree with it, then you'll be accused of erasing the voices of people of color in the space. And of course, in the process of saying this, the ideologue who's confronting you is erasing the voices of truth-respecting voices in the space. But that's neither here nor there. At the very least, leading questions will be posed to cast aspersions onto your character. Why don't you want the lived experiences of black people to play a role in inquiry? Do you think black people are just lying when they say they've experienced depression? You know, this kind of shit. The idea here being that you're a racist, and the non-racist thing to do is to comply with this hostile takeover of your epistemological standards. As so many people have by now discovered, critical race theory, among other variants of critical theory, is less interested in justifying its beliefs via reason and evidence than with specious rhetoric that's been carefully calculated to enforce compliance. And the answer to these kinds of accusations is to invoke the problem of underdetermination. It's to force the ideologue to acknowledge that there's a difference between your experience of a phenomenon, like being approached and followed by a retail clerk the moment you enter a store, and your interpretation of that phenomenon. E.g., they followed me because they don't want me to walk around their store unsupervised, because they think I'm more likely to steal something because I'm black, right? As opposed to an alternative explanation for that, like maybe they just wanted to make sure that you're properly taken care of, or that your decision to interpret that event in that particular way might actually have something to do with your indoctrination into a way of thinking that encourages adherents to interpret all such interactions in the least charitable light.
There's even a joke about that, right, with the feminism, and it's that, you know, something happens to everybody, women most affected.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So if you point this out, you know, the most likely rebuttal is you're gonna hear something to the effect that everybody is an expert in their own experiences. We're all experts of our experiences, and you know, you contradicting this, they're misrepresenting you as gaslighting people into thinking that they've not experienced what they've in fact experienced. But in reality, you're not denying anyone's experience, only their interpretation of it. If everyone's interpretation of their experiences was incorrigible, then it would follow that, for example, white nationalists' interpretation of their own negative experiences with black people would be every bit as valid as the interpretations favored by the critical race theorist. Everyone's contradictory interpretations of their experiences would allow for the absurd state of affairs where all contradictory propositions are true. So, you know, you could counter that as, here's this argument, hey, what you're proposing is absurd. It doesn't work if you generalize it.
It's really funny that they're so caught in that, too, because it's an everyday experience that like, you know, Benjamin, you sent me a text and I, you know, didn't read the right, you know, tone of voice that you had in your head when you typed the text. And now I think you said this like really rude thing, but really you were actually saying something very kind, and I've just totally misinterpreted it. Sometimes we go months where we're not even friends now because of a total misinterpretation. We didn't know what people meant one to another. In other words, the interpretation of the experience that he insulted me. You didn't insult me. You might even have been complimenting me, or it might have been a neutral statement, might have been a joke or whatever. That wasn't even an off color or inappropriate joke, but without the intonation or without other circumstantial facts that somebody might have missed or forgotten, or like maybe they're sick or busy and something like or believe you me, sometimes you just read it wrong. Like you just, or you typed something to me and you left out the word not by mistake. And then we have this massive miscommunication because it literally reverses the meaning of what you said and you didn't know that you did it. I mean, there's so many things where our interpretation of an event is, I mean, it's literally an everyday experience that we run into conflict because we misinterpret something that somebody else did. That it's astonishing that if you try to suggest that you might be misinterpreting the experience that you had, and that there might be a experience or an interpretation of that experience that doesn't put you into this, you know, injured or aggrieved or oppressed role, then, you know, then that might be a more valid interpretation. You know, maybe they didn't actually mean it or whatever. Or on the other hand, maybe they did and they're just an asshole and most people aren't, you know. But no, it's always for them. They seem to, and this is what Christopher Hitchens said, is that the left's new style is that they basically, I can't remember the quote exactly, but they always know your motivation for everything you did. And it's always the worst possible one, but it's also worst possible intersecting with most self-serving for their agenda.
Just and so
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So they'll follow up with a question like, well, who do you feel more compassion for? Which interpretation are you going to support? The people who, we feel compassionate for, or the ones who we presume you feel more compassionate for? Are you going to, do you feel more compassion for oppressed black people or racist white supremacists? Because that's what's going to decide whose interpretations you'll favor. And the correct reply to that is the question of whether black people are oppressed is what's at issue in the first place. You can't use the lived experiences of black people as justification for the proposition that they're oppressed, and then use their alleged oppression as justification for deferring to their lived experience. That's circular.
Why should that matter, though? I mean, if rationality's off the table, if contradiction's off the table, then there's no arguing with this.
If you're dealing with a person who doesn't care that they're contradicting themselves, then move on with your life. There's no point wasting time with that person.
Yeah, but if they're controlling the universe, then there's no getting away from them.
It depends on the context of the conversation that you're having. If you're having shit flinging on Twitter, then fine, you're probably not going to get anywhere. But if you're having a conversation in real life, especially in front of other people, where they at least want to pay lip service to rationality, in order to maintain a certain image. Oh, we're reasonable. We're just asking for reasonable things. Therefore, you should support us. This forces them into a trap. You taken together these objections that I laid out that are appealing to the underdetermination of our beliefs, the absurdity of the kind of relativism being proposed, and the circularity when you appeal to compassion. That exhausts the rhetorical resources of these ideologues. And those are just the logical problems. We haven't even talked about empirical objections pertaining to black people's actual views, as opposed to the views being attributed to them by woke folk. We haven't even talked about several decades worth of psychological research into cognitive distortions and how certain types of simple social interactions can enforce conformity and compliance without anybody noticing. But anyway, at this stage of this kind of conversation, they can be led to ask, finally, when you get them to ask the relevant question, by what standards do we decide which out of a potential number of interpretations of a given phenomenon, how do we decide which one is the best? Well, you already know my answer, Benjamin. I saw you writing it down. How do we decide?
Everything is to be interpreted politically, and everything that's political is to be interpreted personally, and then just completely loop that over and over and over again until you win.
That's totally my view. Thanks, Ben. No, my answer. You all know my answer by now. It's the big four. It's your view has to be situated within a model that's compliant with the big four, and. What you've done in this instance is you've maneuvered the conversation away from justification in terms of compassion or proving that you aren't racist or dubious appeals to the expertise of someone who relays their interpretations of what happens to them, and moved it away from that and towards standards of justification that are used in all other modes of inquiry, thus holding critical race theory and other theories like this to the standards of scientific scrutiny, standards which by its very character it's never going to be able to meet.
And once people get hooked on that, then they get to start to build knowledge rather than collapse knowledge, right? They're able to differentiate and move into different realms of knowledge production, biology, math, arts, rather than having to see everything through one lens.
Right. Yeah, exactly. The reason why they're able to see everything through one lens, from even looking at all of these diverse things, the reason the mechanism that allows them to undifferentiate all of these different modes of learning and modes of being, modes of knowledge, is the infinite flexibility of the kinds of the kinds of frameworks that they're using. Yeah. And so you have to force them away from the qualitative and the phenomenological and the historicist and interpretive frameworks whose infinite flexibility allows them to conclude whatever they want. You have to force them into a data-driven, empirical mode of inquiry governed by the standards of the Big Four. And, there's still ways they can try to resist the Big Four. They can try to resist the Big Four on the grounds that they're the epistemic tools of the oppressor. Okay, well, apply the defensive capabilities of the nuke and show that these Big Four are actually the same epistemic tools that are shared by everyone by virtue of our evolutionary history. Mm-hmm. If they try to resist the Big Four on the grounds that the standards are unreasonable for the kinds of questions that they're trying to address, then just apply the nuke's offensive capabilities by arguing that policy decisions should not be driven by what, at this point in the conversation, is self-confessed, speculative, and unscientific modes of thinking. And when they ultimately relent and submit to the Big Four, bringing up in their defense things like implicit association studies, callback studies, law enforcement statistics, the works, they lose because the data is not on their side. But before you can get to that point, you must force them away from these modes of thinking that allow for infinite flexibility. Because with the aid of these modes of thinking, with the aid of these infinitely flexible frameworks, they're allowed to conclude whatever they want. There are no standards that are constraining.
Except that you're wrong and they're right.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
So, yeah. I think there's also a psychological thing that's beyond the purview of this conversation, but in my own research and studying the lived experience of people caught up into this, and also the phenomenological, sociological events and behaviors that manifest as outcomes of the woke ideology, people just aren't happy. It's just people that take this up are not, they're miserable. And there's got to be a lot of different ways, and maybe that's where art comes in, showing that, or just being in a human relationship, showing that people aren't miserable, and then giving them the choice not to feel that way, and then pointing, and then reverse engineering. Well, maybe it's your beliefs, you know. So there's other tact than the strictly scientific one.
I mean, it's very important to realize why that misery becomes sort of a cycle that they get caught up in, or a cyclone even that they get caught up in. And it's ultimately because the ideology is rooted in this so-called dialectical subject-object, you know, whatever you want to say, but this ultimately subjective and social view of the world. So the idea is, of course, that you are creating the world according to what you envision in your mind. You start as a subject, and you bring the object into being and come to know yourself through it. And then therefore, when your object is not becoming what you want it to be, when the world is not becoming what you want it to be, when your life is not becoming what you envision, what you hope for in your mind, like you just picture that you're going to have this great life and be accepted and great whatever it is, whether it's career, whether it's, you know, get to sit around all day and knit or read or whatever it is, make art, whatever it is you think you're going to do, work on your collective farm, you know,
hunt
hang
on
out
the
with your
morning,
friends.
fish in the afternoon, literary criticism in the evening.
Yeah, that's
perfect.
Literally the vision. When that's not happening, the reason isn't because you are doing something wrong. The reason is that you want to bring their explanation for the reason that your subjective idea is not manifesting in objective reality through the ultimately dialectical tension between the subject and object is because there are other subjects who have other ideas who are in your damn way. They are limiting, they are creating systems of dominance that limit the possibility of subjective creation. They are literally creating a circumstance in which they are causing other people to work for their vision of the world. And so you can't manifest what you imagine your life to be in kind of almost a schizoid personality disorder, fictional kind of way. Mm-hmm. And you can't manifest that, but the reason isn't because you're doing something stupid or it's not real or any of this. It's because other people are dominating your vision with their vision and incorporating you into their vision of the world and exploiting you and in the process and alienating you from your capacity to be productive. So the entire philosophy is actually built to outsource blame for your own failure to not just any other particular person, but to everybody else. And that, of course, gains its greatest power when they pick particular scapegoats. And in this case, you know, with critical race theory, they scapegoat whiteness. Within queer theory, they scapegoat normalcy. Within Marxism, they scapegoat property holders and bourgeoisie. And so they pick a scapegoat ideology.
And in social constructivism, they scapegoat science. Who's the scapegoat of
social
science?
Constructivism is a kind of broad-ranging...
it's a tool.
Yeah, it's a tool that fits within this. It's not its own ideology. Like queer theory or critical race theory or Marxism
I was just
would be their
wondering
own ideologies.
who's the scapegoat when science is scapegoated. What's the pattern? Who's generally doing that?
You'll see it's always done in some other language. The Marxists previously called it bourgeois science. So the bourgeoisie were scapegoated for using the wrong kind of science that didn't advance
Western
Marxist
science.
theory.
Okay.
Yeah, and then you see now that it's white empiricism or whatever it is that, like, what's her name, Chandra Prescott-Weinstein said it causes there to be racism in physics.
That woman exhausts me.
Oh God, I know. And so then, within queer theory, they're going to say that it's cis heteronormative masculinist science that is the problem. And the feminists obviously rode the masculinist science horse until it fell in the river back in the 80s and 90s. And so social constructivism is the name for the broad view that what's actually happening is that everybody in the social circumstance has their own subjective thing that they're bringing into the world, and some of them have dominance that are able to construct how the social reality is going to play out, and thus what the total limits of subjectivity are, which thus limits in a very harmful and negative way the people who are in the oppressed positions. And that's in fact what oppression means. And that then, so it's not that the social constructivists, that's all of these people. They believe that society is constructed. It is all of history is the series of constructed social relations that limit people's subjectivity and create opportunities for certain people to dominate other people and to exploit them from their true essence as creator.
Yeah.
I'm telling you, this is a crackpot religion.
I really like the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's characterization of social constructionism, where they say something to the effect of, if there's any core idea in social construction, it's to show that our conceptions of things might have been otherwise under a different set of social relations. And to some degree, for some things, that's true. And I talk about some of those things in my series, Nuking Social Constructionism. But for a lot of the things that they're trying to go after, a lot of the revolutionary kind of changes they're trying to impose, that doesn't really hold up under scrutiny. You see, often they'll engage in certain kinds of tricks. They'll try to characterize something that isn't a social construct in terms of things that are socially constructed, like discourses and institutions, things that might actually stand independently of discourses and institutions, and things that whose understanding historically preceded the existence of these things. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Watch my video series, whoever's watching.
That's the conceptual penis as a social construct.
Yeah.
Because the penis, in that paper, we didn't say that they don't exist. We said that we just shouldn't think of them as anatomical organs. We should think of them in terms of the way that there are social constructions built around it. So now the penis as a construct, but what they've actually done is said the way people talk about penises and think about penises and all these kind of social, what they think are social, I don't even know if that's all socially constructed, but because it's obviously describing something that that's being seen in reality.
Like French use the feminine for a penis. It's la pine or whatever it is. So the gendered construction that the French apply to the penis is separable from the penis, because the penis, being a male organ, can't be a feminine, but French feminize it for some reason.
That's weird.
Yeah,
I got nothing on that.
Well, I'm just saying. There's we construct things around the penis.
Well, I suppose.
And they could be otherwise in other circumstances, right?
Yeah. The point is that what Crocoduck has said is correct, that they invoke social constructivism where it doesn't actually apply in order to try to drag the argument back into this frame. And what they're ultimately attempting to do, because of that submission to the social or socialist man paradigm, is that they are trying to drag, when they do this, what they're trying to do is they're trying to drag everything into a frame where everybody agrees with their theory, or else they are the creators of the oppression that limits the subjectivity and that causes all the meaningful problems of the world, which just so happen to correspond intimately with what they think they need in order to live their entitled lives. Very much like the old quote that got dragged up in the atheism arguments so often, which was, I forget, was this Eleanor Roosevelt or something, who remarked that she distrusts the religious often when they say what God wants, because it so frequently perfectly corresponds with what they actually want. And it's the same kind of thing. They want other people. The problem with the woke or communist ideology is that the entire thing is premised, this entire social man ideology is premised on the idea that everybody else has to tailor their beliefs, their attitudes, their approach to life in order to accommodate the theorist who has become inconsolable if they're not getting their way. And so ultimately you end up empowering a very small number of bullies with probably psychological and emotional disorders, because those are the people who will cleave to this most readily and who will rise to the top in such an order. And everybody has to accommodate their psychopathy constantly, because if they're not getting their way and they're able to be sufficiently effective at pushing the theory, it is that everybody's lack of adherence to what they think they need in order to be the fully realized subject is dependent on everybody else doing what they say. And so that's why it's ultimately totalitarian. That's why it ultimately is destructive. That's why it ultimately is going to cause calamity everywhere it goes, is because it ultimately becomes serving, very self-serving to the very small number of people who believe that they can only realize themselves fully as subject, or a megamaniacal subject at that, because they see themselves as the creator of the subjective universe that becomes the objective universe, etc. It only works, however, when everybody submits to that particular view, and that particular view is only being adhered to because that person happened to obtain enough power, whether that's through rhetoric or whether that's through the barrel of a gun, as Mao had it, to make other people participate in it.
KC, do you get a disagreement with that?
I have nothing to add to that at this time.
It is a deeply religious cult that's extraordinarily dangerous. And at the moment, it's just a kind of society dissolving catastrophe because it's not centralized enough. As a matter of fact, I don't think that wokeness will become centralized, partly because it's fractured into this kaleidoscopic intersectional thing where every different identity group and intersection has to have its chance to speak up and squabble and be at the table. But secondly, because the people who are pushing woke with the money behind it, for example, with the actual power is, they aren't actually people that think like this. They are people who are using it. Big corporations,
right?
For example.
This alliance, I hate to rip off Peter Hitchens, but this alliance between woke folk and what they'll call neoliberal, basically corporate forces, is probably the most cynical and sinister alliance since the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. If you want to look at the most deformed, disgusting thing in our society right now, the name of it is woke capitalism, or at least that's the name that they give to it. I'm fine with taking that name as well. It's Chase putting their logo on a pride parade. It's Spotify putting Black Lives Matter logos on its Twitter page, and putting rainbows on its Twitter page, at least in America, and then in Middle Eastern countries, curiously, the rainbows are gone.
What was that meme about the M&Ms? There's a story: child labor producing chocolate for M&Ms, and then the M&Ms saying, "I'm gay, look at me." Right?
Yeah,
that kind of shit.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's Lindsay Ellis talking about solidarity and talking about whatever it is, whatever the woke talking point is this week or during the week when she still made videos, and then saying, by the way, this video is brought to you by Audible, a subsidiary of the Amazon Corporation. You go, girl. This kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's correct. There is a very unholy alliance going on here, and there are a number of ways to characterize or frame it that maybe are not best for this conversation. But certainly what's happened is that both fascists and communists have realized that they have much more advantage if they have a handshake agreement between one another to advance their goals. In fact, my view at this point is that they are no longer sufficiently differentiated to where it matters who actually comes out on top. And I say fascists in this regard, not meaning specifically Nazis, but more specifically the definition given by Mussolini, which was corporatists. So the public-private partnership, as it were, that they talk about at the World Economic Forum, for example. And so what I see with this, actually knowing kind of how they view things religiously, is that in order to solve the production problem that the Soviets were always plagued by, that socialist and communist states have always been plagued by, that they realized that they had to incorporate markets somehow. They had to synthesize in markets, and that will solve the production problem. And then so what you end up with then is just basically a super two-tiered society, as these communist things always do, because they always produce a super aristocracy who get to live, these fabulous lives of wealth and leisure and comfort, while everybody else, doesn't necessarily have a job to go to because the robots are doing it for them and the AI is doing it for them. And so they can get a UBI that's really buying their data off of them so that the big corporations can make their predictions, so they can figure out how to make the money that keeps the system rolling. And to keep them fat, dumb, and happy, they get something like communism. They get social justice across the board. We'll just average everybody out. We'll make sure everybody has equity. We're going to make sure all those differences, which also, by the way, might cause unrest and instability that might break the system that they're trying to implement, we'll make sure that that's all smashed down and evened out, cooled off and calmed down. And so I don't see them any longer as being separate. I see two sides of the same coin, and that coin is, how do we get basically something like global communism that solves the production problem that communism always produces, because there's absolutely no drive for innovation. We can get even deeper into this if you want, but they talk about the need to create. There's the useless class, which is us, and then there's the creative class of the anointed people who get to be basically party apparatchiks. And the creative class are going to be the ones who are going to have interesting things to do, be in the upper echelon of society.
Make their comic book movies and
whatever it takes.
Vice articles or...
Yeah, whatever meta content you need to enjoy the metaverse, and put on your goggles and accidentally punch a kid. I saw that video on the internet the other day. Some woman put on her VR goggles and starts swinging her arm around, and I don't know if she's doing boxing. She just clocks her kid right in the head. In reality, turns out, there was actually a physical object there, and putting on the goggles did not remove you from physical reality. But so it goes. It's kind of a visual display of kind of the arrogance and silliness here. But that was a digression. I see no distinction between the two there, though I do also recognize, we talked about fascism as the autoimmune response to the cancer earlier. That's its own separate problem. The something, I don't know, Hitlerian or Francoian, is that a word? Or
okay, so when you're talking about corporate fascism, communist, that's a more structural thing rather than the populist fascism that we think of when we think of Hitler and the Aryan man, or some sort of conception of a
state capitalism. It's that the state has fused with the biggest corporate leaders, who basically have a operative handshake agreement besides revolving doors between their who's at their decision making board tables and whatever else, but they have a handshake agreement that corporations can act with basically monopolistic or oligopolistic impunity, so long as you make sure that you install things that control the people in ways where we, the government, won't be deposed from our power, to continue doing what we're doing. So the state and you don't need explicit state capitalism like they've integrated in China, but you have something that works kind of the other way around, where the oligopoly is now sort of this thing that sort of keeps the government in its pocket, and the government, as long as they control the people, don't take the actions that they could take to break up the big corporations for these monopolistic and trust level activities that they shouldn't be engaging in.
Mm-hmm. Does pluckish grassroots liberalism stand a chance against this?
I think if we look at the truckers, the answer is probably yes. We can create a lot more trouble for them than we think we can. It's almost like people just being people and not going along with what they're told to do. I compare it all the time to that picture that I've seen on the internet a million times of the elephant tied to a folding chair, little aluminum folding chair. The elephant's just standing there. But when it realizes that just because it has the leash on it doesn't mean it's tied to something that's going to hinder its movement. And I don't know, maybe we'll see this with the trucker convoys. The people are flexing their muscle a bit. It turns out that we're not in this like high-tech Star Trek world they want to pretend that we're going to, where, we'll just get rid of all the truckers and we'll have the trucks drive themselves. We don't actually have this. Even if we have the technology, we don't have it installed sufficiently to enable this. And where did Trudeau go? Did Trudeau, come out and try to deal with? No, he fled the country. So the people that are trying to voice this on us can still be deposed from power. They can be removed from power, and people who are opposed to these things can replace them. The window has not slammed shut on us. So I think it does, but it does require people to realize that freedom's on the line, period. And the threat is significant. And it turns out that the woke stuff is just a means to an end for this. It's ultimately extremely stupid. And I don't think a whole lot of woke policy is going to stay in place once they have absolute control, because woke is a destabilizing force, and a perfectly sustainable, as they would say, regime does not want destabilizing forces running rampant throughout it. So I don't think it's going to...
I believe Uncle Yuri had something to say about this.
Didn't he? Yes. Yeah. You'll be the first against the wall. That's what he said. Uncle Yuri.
Casey, what's your take on pluckish grassroots liberalism's chance against wokedom?
Well, look, we're going to have to fight like hell. The road ahead is difficult. It's not something that's going to be achieved, and it's not even something that there's no such thing as some inevitable historical trend. Maybe liberalism will die. The rule over the course of human history has been that dictators and tyrants and people whoever it is who controls the military, they get to decide how society is organized. They get to decide how social, and what America and what modern liberal democratic states have is the exception, historically speaking, and not the rule. And there's no good reason to believe why. At least from my point of view, there's no good reason to believe that this rule will necessarily continue to hold in the face of technological advances. I think that there were some historical points of origin, an intersecting point of origin historically between what eventually became the liberal democratic state and what eventually became modern science. The modern kind of scientific institutions, when science went from this kind of disorganized state into its much more organized state with the quote unquote scientific revolution, right? That intersecting circumstance, I don't think necessarily played a causal role in either case. I do think that you need strong liberal democratic institutions in order to be able to perform the scientific activity to the greatest possible degree. But my point is, improved technology does not necessarily equal improved liberal democratic order. You need that. There's another ingredient in there that you need. So I can definitely see the possibility of a future where liberalism is dead. It's gone forever. It never comes back. and you have you basically have the neon dystopia. You have you live in the cyberpunk world. I don't want that world, and I'm gonna do what I can to protect these valuable and vulnerable liberal democratic institutions. But the time to act was yesterday. So. Are
you saying you don't want like hearing implants or like cool things like a new arm that can punch through a wall?
I'm fine with that. I want those things. What I don't want is the social organization in which the individual no longer matters, and
where you're literally just a statistic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm hopeful that liberalism will prevail, but I'm conscious of the fact that if it doesn't, then it's probably gone for good. We had this historical moment for the past 300 years. There's no reason to believe that over the course of human history that this won't be looked back upon as a brief golden era in an otherwise dark and terrifying world.
I kind of want to end it there. Is that where we should end it? Do you have any final words?
Yeah. If you don't want that, then do something. Resist undifferentiation.
Hashtag undifferentiate or differentiate.
Undifferentiate.
Yeah. Resist the undifferentiation.
Right. Resist undifferentiation.
Yeah.
Differentiate. Yes, yeah. Hashtag differentiate.
Be unique. Well, thanks, guys. I'm going to wrap up the recording now. We can have a little after time and chill out. But thanks you both for finally meeting together on a public forum. Is this the first time you guys have spoken like on a YouTube or a podcast or something like that?
Yeah, most of our communication has been over the phone.
Oh, great. I'm glad to make it public. Pop the lid off of that.
Mm-hmm. Nicely done, Benjamin.
Thank you.